Around 7 years ago, I made my first video game. In this video, I'll summarize my first 7 years of learning video game development. My journey in learning video game development began with the greatest game engine of all time, Scratch. For as long as I can remember, I've always liked playing games. Pokemon on the DS, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and Dota 2 were some of my favorites. I also enjoyed making tabletop games in my free time. However, I didn't get into video game development early on and knew nothing about how to code or about game engines like Unity or Unreal. So, when I was exposed to Scratch for the first time as a kid, I thought it was the perfect starting point, since it let you make games without code. The first thing I made in Scratch was a small game where you played as a green ball. The goal of the game was to avoid touching the other enemy balls for as long as possible. One of the mechanics was that you could vanish and summon a green lion that froze any ball that touched it, except the red ball, which would follow you at all times. After that, in 2017, I made another game in Scratch that was a little more complicated. It was a 2-player PvP strategy game, where each player would learn a move on their turn, then use their moves during the battle phase. In hindsight though, there wasn't that much strategy involved and you would just spam all your moves during the battle phase. Around this time was also when I started using a website called Pixel Art, which allowed me to create simple and quick pixel art for my games. In 2018, I made a game where you hired and upgraded goblins to mine gold, while an orc walked back and forth trying to kill them. The goal was to get the most amount of gold possible in 2 minutes by upgrading the right things at the right times. In 2020, I made my final games in Scratch. The first one was actually inspired by one of my previous Scratch games, the Goblin Mining one. The twist though was that for this new game, it was PvP, both players had an orc they could upgrade, and the goal was to destroy the enemy's base. The second game I made in 2020 was a fighting game. I was of course inspired by games like Street Fighter, but you probably wouldn't have guessed that I took heavy inspiration from the game Skullgirls Mobile. At the time, I was pretty into that game and thought it would be cool to take the mechanic of automatically moving forward, but adding the twist of not letting the players retreat. And that was the last game I made in Scratch. I spent a lot of time with Scratch, and there was one thing that bothered me. Although there are probably much better reasons to not continue using Scratch, like lack of customization and the limitation of block coding, the biggest issue for me was that you couldn't really export your game from Scratch's website, meaning you could not export EXEs directly from Scratch. So in 2020, I chose to move on from Scratch, and with that came the end of my Scratch era. After all those Scratch games, I wanted to make something bigger. I wanted to make a quote-unquote real game, or something that could be played for longer than just 5 or 10 minutes. I was still hesitant on learning code, so I set out to find an engine that could make a more legit looking game without the need to code. And after some searching, I found a game engine called RPG Maker MV. I found this YouTube series called RPG Maker MV Beginner Tutorials and watched the entire playlist to help me learn the engine. For my first big game, I decided to keep a small scope and make a game that I could finish in a reasonable amount of time. Just kidding. For some reason, I thought it would be a great idea to make a JRPG with a story and many locations to explore. I was making some progress, but after a couple months, I came to the realization that, yeah, I bit off way more than I could chew. There's no way I'm finishing this game. So, I scrapped the JRPG. But I didn't just quit. Using the remains of the old game, I began making a turn-based roguelike where you started on floor 1 and fought all the way up to the final floor. Along the way, you would level up, learn new abilities, and get better gear. Since I still had some completed items, abilities, and enemies from the JRPG, I was able to save a lot of time when remaking the game, and within a couple of months, I had a finished game. The biggest thing I learned from making this game was scope management. I realized I needed to set realistic goals for future games, ones I could actually finish. Also, after creating over 40 enemies for the game, I learned a lot about how to make enemies that are interesting and challenging obstacles to the player. Even though I was able to finish making a game in RPG Maker, there are things that I didn't really like about the engine, kind of like Scratch. The thing was, RPG Maker was built for one style of game. Plus, since the engine was designed to not require coding, it felt restrictive in terms of customization. Last but not least, solutions for multiplayer felt scarce, and the type of games I wanted to make most was online multiplayer. Because of these things, I decided to find a new engine. During that time, I heard a lot of good things about the Unity engine, and how it was great for indie game development. There was one problem though. It required coding. I was still scared of coding, so I hit up an old programmer friend and asked if he wanted to make a game with me. He was on board, and we started working on an online PvP strategy game in Unity. The game was based on a tabletop game that I made a while ago, so we had a solid foundation for the game's design. Initially, there was some progress, but that soon came to a halt. Understandably, my friend wasn't as invested in the game as I was, since it was a game that I wanted to make. That's when I realized, if I wanted things done,
fine. I'll do it myself.
At this point, I knew that I had to learn how to code if I wanted to move forward with game dev. Some time had passed and I finally had some free time over the summer. I remembered a site called Udemy, which had courses online about coding and multiplayer networking, and the grind began. After watching and following along in the courses, I was finally confident enough to start working on my next game. It was an online PvP auto battler game that was actually inspired by one of my old Scratch games, that one Goblin Orc PvP game. I started off simple, 2 units that automatically battled each other and respawned after they died. Once that was done, I turned to 2 of the greatest sites ever for game dev assets, itch.io and OpenGameMart. This was the first time I used these sites for any of my games, and they were very helpful for a non-artist game dev like myself. After that, I made sure the game worked in single player, and that all the basic mechanics were implemented. Then came the hard part, multiplayer netcode. Making sure that players didn't desync or lag out often was a nightmare, but I was able to solve a lot of these issues by doing a lot of playtesting and making the game fully deterministic. The finished game had multiple units on both teams that fought automatically, items that the players could buy to make the Skeleton King stronger, and a special unit, the Angel of Death, that could only be summoned once per battle. Some of the things I learned from making this game were a solid foundation of C#, how to use Unity, and how to do multiplayer networking. After making my auto battler game, I wanted to try making a game with something different. At the time, my best friend was really into Roblox, and so I thought, why not make a Roblox game? Also, before this point, I had never made any 3D games, so I thought it would be a good learning experience. See what I did there? Anyway, I did some brainstorming on what game I should make, and remembered a game I played before on Roblox called Dodgeball. That's when the idea clicked. I was going to make the best dodgeball game on Roblox. Before I could do that though, I first had to learn how to make a game in Roblox. This meant learning Lua, the coding language that the Roblox engine uses. I found some courses online and followed along to learn the process of making a Roblox game. Since I already had experience working with multiplayer, doing multiplayer in Roblox wasn't too bad. However, because Roblox can be played on phones, I had to consider how the game would feel on mobile devices, like where the on-screen buttons should be and how big or small they should be. When starting to make my dodgeball game, first I made sure the basics worked. Firing a ball and taking damage. Then I added the ability to join teams and a place where teams could fight. To truly make this the best dodgeball game on Roblox, I had to add some spice to the gameplay, aka the fun part. I added a dash with a cooldown, a once per game shield, and the ability to become a ghost for a short duration, making you immune to all enemy balls. Initially, that was it. The game was ready for release, but something felt off. The court was flat and boring. There was no room for creativity or strategy. To fix this, I added ramps and blocks to the court. Now, players could hide behind cover, pull off crazy trick shots, or even ricochet off their own balls for some wild plays. I also added leaderboards so players could see where they ranked. Finally, after releasing the game, I got feedback about how there should be a free-for-all mode. So I added a large free-for-all arena, creating an even more chaotic experience. After trying out Roblox, I decided that I still preferred to use Unity, which is what I made my next game in. I already made a relatively complex game in Unity, so I wanted to make a game that was a bit more straightforward but still fun. I've always been super interested in rock, paper, scissors, so much so that I've done experiments and even made entire spreadsheets to form the perfect strategy. Naturally, my next game was going to be the greatest RPS-styled game on Steam. The twist? There were 4 options instead of 3, players had HP and SP, and there were multiple maps that affected the round-to-round gameplay. When making this game, I learned how to integrate Steam features with my games, like adding Steam achievements. I also got a lot better at making smooth animations and better looking UI compared to my previous games. Now all that leads to my newest game that I released on Steam around 3 months ago. I really liked my auto battler game, and it had the most players out of all my games by far. But let's be honest, it wasn't exactly polished. Back then, there were things that I wanted to add that I just wasn't confident in doing, due to me being a beginner game dev and lacking the necessary skills. However, now that I had a lot more experience under my belt, it was time to make the sequel and add everything that I wanted to add. That I knew how to, at least. I reworked a ton of things, from redesigning the health bars, to adding smoke effects, and coin animations for kills. The in-game shop got a major upgrade, as did the overall UI. But I didn't just stop there. I added a ton of new items, some with visual effects, allowed players to ban items during PvP, introduced a brand new mercenary unit, and even implemented a mechanic inspired by Dota, denying tombstones. To top it all off, I added online leaderboards and created a vault system that generated passive income with compound interest. Yes, even the math became more exciting. This sequel taught me so much about how to polish a game and how to integrate social and competitive features that make a game feel alive and connected. And that's 7 years of learning video game development, from scratch to Steam. However, the journey is far from over. For my next game, I'm thinking of creating a card game, a party game, or maybe a board game? As you can tell, I haven't fully decided yet. But if you want to see what I make next, make sure to subscribe and join my Discord. Thanks for watching.